Trump had done this before. The mockery wasn't accidental. It wasn't a slip of the tongue at the end of a long day, the kind of thing a press secretary walks back with a careful statement by morning. It was deliberate. It was confident. It was the kind of contempt you deploy when you are absolutely certain the room belongs to you, when you have calculated correctly that the audience will laugh, that the cameras will roll, and that the target of the joke is too small, too polite, and too dependent on your goodwill to do anything about it. He stood in front of his crowd and he mocked Canada's military, not obliquely, not in diplomatic code. Directly, specifically, with the casual ease of a man who had checked the math and decided the risk was zero. Canada's defense spending, Canada's troop numbers, Canada's contribution to an alliance that the United States built, funds, and, in this telling, essentially operates alone while smaller, weaker nations show up with their modest forces and call themselves partners. The crowd laughed. The clip circulated. The White House said nothing because there was nothing to walk back. It had landed exactly as intended. That was hour zero. 38 hours later, 19 NATO nations had publicly sided with Mark Carney. Not privately, not through diplomatic back channels that only analysts read. Publicly, on the record. Through official NATO channels, with 19 signatures, in a document that named Canada's military contributions with the kind of clinical, operational specificity that cannot be argued with, cannot be spun, and cannot be made to disappear. 19 of America's closest allies had looked at what the President of the United States said about Canada's military and responded collectively with documented facts. And the White House had no answer. The question is not what happened. The question is how. How does a joke at a rally become a geopolitical realignment in less than 2 days? How does a president who has spent years using NATO as leverage find himself on the wrong side of 19 members of that same alliance? How does a man who bills himself as the world's greatest dealmaker walk into a room that was already prepared for exactly what he was about to say and not know it? Because here is what you need to understand. When Trump made that joke about Canada's military, he was not just insulting a country. He was testing a theory. The theory was that America's allies are dependent, that their dependency creates deference, and that deference means they will absorb any humiliation rather than risk the relationship. It is a theory he had applied successfully in enough rooms with enough foreign leaders that it had begun to feel like a law of nature. You mock the smaller partner. The smaller partner smiles. Everyone moves on, except Mark Carney had spent the previous 6 weeks making sure that when this moment came, and he believed this moment was coming, it would not play out that way. Not this time. Not with this president, not with this alliance. And what happened in the 38 hours that followed was not just the most significant diplomatic rebuke of this presidency. It may be the most consequential demonstration of Allied solidarity in the history of the modern NATO alliance. Not because of what was said, because of what it revealed about who, in the end, had actually done the work. Let me take you back to the beginning, not to hour zero, to the 6 weeks before it. Because the story of those 38 hours doesn't start with a joke at a rally. It starts with a quiet, deliberate, methodical operation that Mark Carney ran almost entirely out of public view. An operation that most political journalists missed completely because it didn't look like an operation. It looked like a former central banker doing his homework. Carney had been watching the pattern. Anyone paying close attention had been watching the pattern. The president had a template for handling allies he considered weak or dependent. He would apply economic pressure. He would make public statements that tested the allies' willingness to push back. If the ally pushed back, he would escalate, not because escalation served a strategic purpose, but because backing down in public was not in his psychological vocabulary. If the ally absorbed the pressure in silence, he would press harder because silence confirmed the theory. The theory being that the relationship at its core was one of patron and clients don't fight patrons. Carney had watched the trade confrontation play out. He had watched the phone call that ended with a crash. He had watched other allied leaders navigate the same dynamic. And he had arrived at a specific conclusion that shaped everything that followed. The only thing that changes this dynamic is not matching the aggression. It is making the cost of the aggression visible to people whose opinion the president cannot ignore. Not the press. Not foreign governments. The people who have stood next to Canadian soldiers in actual operational theaters. The people who have read the classified assessments of what NATO's collective operations would have looked like without Canada's specific contributions. The people who know that the public mockery and the private operational reality are not the same document. So Carney started making calls. Not loud calls. Not calls that generated press releases. Personal calls, minister to minister, with a simple and consistent message. Canada is not asking for your support. Canada is asking you to look at data we are submitting to NATO Command and decide for yourselves whether the public framing of Canada's military role matches the operational record you know personally. That is all. Look at the data. He called the British Prime Minister. He called the French president. He called the German chancellor. He called the defense ministers of the Netherlands, Norway, Denmark, Poland, and 8 other NATO members who had served alongside Canadian forces in Afghanistan, in Latvia, in the Baltic states, in every major NATO operation of the past 25 years. He wasn't asking them to take Canada's side in a political dispute with Washington. He was asking them to be prepared to speak to facts they already knew. There is a difference. He understood that difference precisely. It was the entire strategy. While those calls were happening, Carney's team was preparing a document, not a press release, not a diplomatic note. A formal submission to NATO headquarters in Brussels, 34 pages of operational data, deployment histories, joint mission statistics, shared intelligence contributions, and a single appendix that no one in Washington had anticipated. A comparative analysis. What NATO's collective operations would have looked like over the past 20 years without Canadian participation, not hypothetically. Operationally, mission by mission, with the gaps named and measured. He had that document ready before Trump made the joke. He had filed it with NATO headquarters before he walked to the podium to respond publicly. The statement was the visible move. The filing was the actual move. And by the time the clip of Trump's mockery had circulated through every defense ministry on the continent, 14 of those ministries had already received the document from Ottawa. They had already started reading it. Now let me reconstruct what happened in those 38 hours, because the timeline is the argument. Hour 0. Trump makes the joke. The crowd laughs. The clip goes everywhere. In Washington, it is treated as a successful moment. Red meat rally content that plays well with the base and costs nothing diplomatically because Canada, the target, has no real leverage. In Ottawa, Carney watches the clip in his office. He does not call a press conference. He does not issue a statement. He calls his foreign affairs minister and says 4 words: start the clock. Now. Within 2 hours, the Canadian Foreign Affairs Minister is on calls with counterparts in London, Paris, Berlin, and The Hague. Not emotional calls, not calls about insults or dignity. Strategic calls. The message is identical in each one. The submission is filed. The data is available. We are not asking you to comment on the political situation. We are asking you to read the operational record and decide whether you want to add your name to a factual assessment. That is all. 3 of those calls end with the same 2 words. We will. By hour 4, the NATO Secretary General's office has formally acknowledged receipt of Canada's submission and begun circulating it to member nation defense staffs for review. This is not a political process. It is an administrative one. The data goes to the people who know how to read it, the people who have spent careers in the operational environment those numbers describe. By hour 6, the United Kingdom, France, and Germany, the 3 largest military contributors to NATO after the United States, have privately informed Ottawa that they are prepared to co-sign a formal response. They have not told Washington. There is no obligation to tell Washington. They are responding to a filing with NATO headquarters, which is an alliance institution, not an American one. This distinction will matter enormously in the hours that follow. Hour 6 to hour 18, the coalition builds in silence. And this silence, this 12-hour period in which 19 nations quietly, independently, one by one arrive at the same decision, is the most important part of the story, because it is proof that this was not political coordination. It was not a campaign managed from Ottawa. Canada had submitted data. NATO had circulated it. And nation after nation, defense minister after defense minister, military chief after military chief, read those 34 pages and arrived at the same conclusion. They had served alongside these forces. They knew the operational record personally. They had stood in briefing rooms with Canadian commanders. They had read classified assessments that never make the evening news. They had watched, in real operational environments, what Canadian forces actually contributed. Not the budget percentage, not the GDP commitment. The actual missions. The actual presence in the places that matter to alliance security. The document was not a revelation to them. It was confirmation. And confirmation, when you have just watched the leader of the alliance's most powerful member mock that record publicly in front of a crowd for laughs, confirmation has a particular weight. It means you are not taking a side in a political dispute. You are deciding whether to allow a factual record you know personally to be misrepresented without response. That is a different question. And for 19 nations, the answer was the same. Meanwhile, in Washington, the White House communications team was congratulating itself. The clip was performing well. The base loved it. A senior advisor had described it internally as a perfect moment. Nobody in that room was tracking a 34-page document circulating through NATO defense staffs. Nobody was monitoring the quiet calls between allied defense ministers. Nobody had noticed that the Secretary General's office had processed a formal Canadian submission 2 hours before the joke was even made. They were managing the story they could see. The story they couldn't see was assembling itself, one signature at a time, in 14 capitals simultaneously. Hour 18 to hour 32. Washington notices something is wrong. The White House learned about the NATO coalition the way it learned about most things in this period, too late, from a leak, from a source that simply could not stay quiet about what was coming. A mid-level diplomat from a NATO member nation, uncomfortable with the direction, tipped off a State Department contact. The call was 3 minutes. The message was this: 19 nations are going to issue a joint statement through NATO channels affirming Canada's military contributions using operational data. It will be released within 24 hours. It is going through official channels. And it already has 19 signatures. Within 30 minutes, it was in front of the National Security Advisor. Within an hour, there was an emergency meeting that was not technically about Canada. It was about options. What could the administration do in the next 24 hours to change the trajectory of what was about to land? The options were examined in turn. Option 1, get ahead of it. Issue a preemptive statement acknowledging Canada's military contributions and reframe the president's remarks as lighthearted. This was killed within 10 minutes. Issuing that statement confirmed the administration had no counter-argument to the data. It would look like exactly what it was, a retreat in advance. Option 2, stay silent. Let the statement land and allow the news cycle to move on. This was also killed. Staying silent in the face of a 19-nation joint statement through NATO channels would be reported as acquiescence. Every ally in the world would watch the United States absorb a collective factual rebuke without response and draw their own conclusions. Option 3, call NATO allies directly and ask them to stand down. This was raised, discussed seriously for approximately 8 minutes, and then killed with a finality that one official later described as the fastest unanimous decision I have ever seen in that room. Because everyone in that room understood the same thing simultaneously. That call would be recorded. It would leak. And a recording of the United States government pressuring allied defense ministries to suppress a factual military assessment would be, in the precise words of one senior official present, the thing that actually ends us. There was no option 4. The statement was coming. The data was real. The signatures were legitimate. And the administration had spent 18 hours celebrating a moment that had already, silently, completely, been answered. Hour 32 to hour 38. The statement drops. It comes through official NATO channels at 9:47 in the morning Brussels time. It is not a press release. It is a formal collective assessment carrying the endorsement of 19 member nations and the acknowledgement of NATO headquarters that the data it contains has been verified. It does not mention the president. It does not mention the rally. It does not use the words mockery or insult or contempt. It does not need to. What it does is enumerate, mission by mission, deployment by deployment. It lays out what Canada has done in the field over 25 years of NATO operations. The deployments to Afghanistan, the role of Canadian forces in the Kandahar theater, the contribution to Baltic air policing, the intelligence sharing arrangements that enhanced Allied capacity in every major NATO mission since 1999. The casualty rate, the number that silences rooms, which, adjusted for force size, places Canada among the highest contributing alliance members by any metric that measures actual operational commitment rather than budget percentage. And then, at the end, one closing paragraph. Not emotional, not political, clinical. 19 nations affirm that NATO's collective security is built on the operational record of its members. That record speaks for itself. The statement is dated. It is signed. It is on the permanent record of the alliance. Carney's name is not among the 19 signatories. He had not asked to be. He had submitted the data and stepped back. The statement was written by others. That was the entire point. A former NATO Supreme Allied Commander, speaking the following day, put it in terms now quoted in every major defense publication on the continent. In 40 years of alliance operations, he said, I have never seen a collective factual assessment issued by 19 member nations in response to a public statement by the alliance's leading power. Not once. What happened in those 38 hours was not a political event. It was a structural one. The kind that gets written into the institutional memory of every defense ministry in the alliance and stays there for a generation. And then he said something nobody else was framing correctly. There is a difference between respect and compliance. Compliance is what smaller partners give to larger ones because they have no choice. It is transactional. The moment the power differential shifts, even slightly, compliance evaporates. Respect is different. Respect is earned in the field, over years, in operations where the person next to you either carries their weight or doesn't. Canada has been earning respect in NATO operational theaters since Korea. That respect is not stored in a budget line. It is stored in the memory of every officer who has served alongside Canadian forces, in every Allied defense ministry that has read the classified assessments that never appear in the speech that gets the crowd to laugh. You can mock a budget percentage. You cannot mock an operational record that 19 defense ministers have read personally and chosen to sign their names to. The former commander paused. Then he said, the president walked into a room that was already prepared for him. He just didn't know it. In Moscow, the defense ministry issued no public statement, but Russian state media covered the NATO coalition extensively. 3 separate pieces in the first 6 hours, an unusual editorial priority for an administrative action within an alliance institution. When Russian state media amplifies an allied disagreement, it is not out of journalistic interest. It is because the content serves a strategic purpose. The strategic purpose here was transparent. Show that the NATO alliance is fractured, that American leadership is contested, that the United States cannot command the unified support of its own partners. Except the story did not serve that purpose, because the story was not about NATO fracturing. It was about 19 NATO nations acting in precise, procedural, institutional concert to correct a factual misrepresentation. That is not fracture. That is alliance function. And that distinction told a very different story to Moscow than Russian state media intended. These allies are capable of independent action, and their independent action produced a unified factual response. That is not a weakened alliance. That is an alliance with distributed capacity and institutional confidence. In Beijing, the foreign ministry noted with studied neutrality that the statement reflected the complexity of alliance management in the current period. 4 words that translate, in the specific vocabulary of Chinese diplomatic communication, as "we are watching this very carefully." A former senior CIA official speaking on background was more direct. Every intelligence service in the world just watched 19 of America's closest allies publicly correct the President of the United States on a factual military question. The implication for adversary calculations is not that America is weak. It is that America's allies are capable of acting independently when the facts require it. That changes every model of NATO response capacity that Beijing and Moscow have been running for years. They were modeling a hub-and-spoke alliance, dependent on American coordination for collective action. What they just watched was 19 spokes move together without the hub. That is a different alliance than the one they thought they were dealing with. 2 hours after the NATO statement dropped, Mark Carney held a press conference. And like everything Carney had done in those 38 hours, the press conference was a masterclass in the most devastating weapon available to anyone in a factual argument: restraint. He walked to a simple podium. No flanking ministers, no theatrical backdrop, no visual drama. Just a man in a suit at a podium with a single sheet of paper in his hand. Cameras were running. In Washington, communication staff were watching the feed in real time, preparing responses to whatever attack was coming. He did not attack. He said, "Today, 19 NATO member nations issued a collective assessment of Canada's military contributions to the alliance. Canada is grateful for the thorough and factual review conducted by our allies. We are proud of the operational record that review documents. Canada will continue to meet its obligations to the collective security of this alliance, as it has for 75 years, not because it is required, but because Canada understands that collective security is not a transaction. It is a commitment." He looked up from the paper. Respect in an alliance is not given because of the size of your economy. It is earned in the field, and Canada has been earning it for 75 years. He took 2 questions. He answered both with operational data. He did not mention the president's name. He did not describe the mockery. He did not use a single word that could be characterized as an attack or a celebration. A reporter asked the question everyone was waiting for. "Prime Minister, do you have a response to the president's original remarks about Canada's military?" Carney paused. Not for drama. The pause of a man who has already made his move and is simply deciding whether to explain it or let it stand. He said, "I think the 19 signatures speak more clearly than anything I could add." He left the podium. The press conference lasted less than 8 minutes. It was the most devastating 8 minutes of the entire confrontation. Not because of what Carney said, because of the canyon between his composure and what had been said about Canada 40 hours earlier. One leader stood in front of a crowd and deployed contempt as a political instrument, confident the smaller partner had no response. The other had spent 6 weeks building a response so methodical, so factual, and so carefully routed through institutional channels that it could not be dismissed as political, could not be countered with talking points, and could not be removed from the permanent record of the alliance. One came with a punchline, the other came with a 34-page document and 19 signatures. The split screen wrote itself. So here is where we stand. Trump mocked Canada's military in front of a crowd that laughed. 38 hours later, 19 NATO nations responded with a formal collective assessment built on operational data that the White House could not answer, could not counter, and could not suppress. The coalition was not organized by Canada. It was assembled by the facts. Carney submitted the data. The allies read it. 19 of them decided that the operational record they knew personally could not be allowed to stand uncorrected. The statement is on the permanent record of the alliance. It will be cited in Defense Ministry briefings for years. It will appear in the footnotes of every serious analysis of this period. It will be read by every foreign officer who studies NATO institutional history at any war college on the continent. The mockery will not. Here is the principle this story demonstrates, the one that every serious negotiator, every experienced diplomat, every leader who has actually sat across a table from someone with real leverage already knows. You only mock what you think you can afford to dismiss. The moment you mock it, you are telling the world your assessment of its value. And if your assessment is wrong, if the thing you dismissed is load-bearing, operational, documented, and defended by 19 sovereign nations with their own signatures, the mockery does not disappear. It becomes evidence. Evidence of the gap between what you claim to know and what you actually knew. Trump came with a punchline. The punchline told the world what he believed about Canada's military. The 34-page document told the world what was actually true. The 19 signatures told the world which version the alliance's members believed. You can dismiss Canada's military. You cannot dismiss its allies. And yesterday, its allies spoke. The document is still on the record. The data has not changed. The 19 signatures are permanent. The only thing that has changed is what every defense ministry on the planet now knows with documented certainty, that when facts are submitted through proper channels, when the operational record speaks for itself, when allies are asked not for political solidarity, but for factual confirmation, they will confirm it, unanimously. In writing, through the institutional architecture of the most successful military alliance in human history, Carney is still in Ottawa. The document is still in the NATO record. The data hasn't moved. You can mock Canada's military. You cannot mock its allies. And yesterday, its allies spoke.